Shoma already introduced me a little bit. I'm Christopher Dickey. I'm the Paris bureau chief and also the Middle East editor for Newsweek and thedailybeast.com. And this is Maajid Nawaz, whose title is a little bit more unusual than that. He's an anti-extremist. Now, to be an anti-extremist, I think most people in this room are anti-extremists. Do we have any extremists out there? Everybody's an anti-extremist in a sense, but not everybody has been an extremist, which is the distinction of Maajid. And not everybody has thought through how extremism works as well and as completely as Maajid has. So, how is it that you became an extremist in the first place? Was this a childhood fantasy of yours, or what was it that made you become an extremist, Maajid?
Thank you. So, everyone can hear me? Yeah. So, I was, as was introduced, I was born in Essex. It's a coastal town, Southend-on-Sea, coastal town in the UK. And only had white English friends growing up. I had no Muslim friends, no Pakistani friends, and no generally Asian friends whatsoever. And was perfectly happy with my life until I hit my teenage years and began experiencing some very violent racist attacks. When I mean violent, I mean there was a neo-Nazi paramilitary organization called Combat 18. They would make it their business to engage in what they called Paki bashing. So they would ride around in white vans and try and spot the Paki, and then in completely unprovoked attacks, without warning, jump out. And so I would be around 13, 14, 15 years old, and you'd have these big burly men that would jump out the back of these white vans with machetes this long and would try and stab us for sport. I've had 3, 4, 5 friends stabbed before my eyes. Some of my friends have had hammers put to their heads. This is growing up as a 14-year-old in the UK. Then what compounded the problem was that as well as these racist attacks coming from society, we had the Essex police authorities, which in those days, and I'm going to caveat this because it's far better today, and things have improved, but in those days, they were also institutionally racist, which is a phrase that was coined by an official government investigation into the conduct of British police, the Macpherson report. But we were experiencing that before the Stephen Lawrence murder case and before this report. So at 15 years of age, I was falsely arrested at gunpoint by the Essex police authorities.
Wait a minute. You were getting bashed, but you got arrested.
Well, my brother was playing with a plastic pellet gun, as young children do, and as we know, some people don't go out of playing with guns. But young kids play with plastic, it was called a BB gun. He was playing with this plastic gun, and an old lady saw him, nothing against old ladies, but she decided that he must be about to rob a bank. So it's a true story, she reported him to the police, and they mounted a day-long surveillance operation. And I was 15 at the time, and I was playing pool with him, and we left to go home at around 3 a.m., and we saw that the road was blocked ahead of us, and with a police car, and the road was blocked behind us, and we imagined that somebody was in trouble. And there were police helicopters flying, in the sky, and we thought, well, someone's done something. And then suddenly the spotlight shone on our car, and it dawned upon us that they were after us, and I had no idea that he'd been playing with a plastic pellet gun in the daytime. So we were forced to stop, and we were violently arrested at gunpoint, guns put to our heads, and dragged out of the car, thrown to the floor, and told that we were being arrested for suspicion of armed robbery. I was released the next morning with an apology, and the gun was handed back to us. But it's these sorts of experiences, and this is one incident I'm relating to you. And again, the racist attacks were more varied than even what I've just described. And then finally, Bosnia, was happening around the same time.
So we're talking 93, 94?
Yeah. So when you see abroad that you've got white, blonde hair, blue-eyed Muslims being massacred just because they're Muslim, and then at home you're experiencing this type of attack, as a young teenager, you're ripe for, you have an identity crisis, you have a fundamental insecurity complex, you don't know who you are. I didn't feel Muslim. At the same time, I didn't feel Pakistani, because I didn't speak Urdu, English is my mother tongue. I speak English at home with my parents, and I had no way of relating to Pakistan, being born in the UK, and at the same time didn't feel at home in the UK. Now, these are the key ingredients when we look at radicalization. We look at an identity crisis, a sense of a grievance, whether real or perceived, that leads a young, angry teenager to seek out a subculture. And I want to finish this point just by saying one last thing. These are not excuses. And one of the reasons why I'm doing the work I'm doing now is because I feel responsible for everything I did after that. So I'm not making excuses. What I'm looking to do is analyze some of the factors that lead to somebody being susceptible to adopting extremist ideas.
Just quickly, you say you didn't feel particularly Muslim. I mean, had you been fasting during Ramadan? Did you pray 5 times a day? Did you pray at all?
No.
No to all of the above.
Yeah. And that's common, by the way, for people, young Muslim men especially, who join Islamist extremist groups. And when I say Islamist, I mean those groups that seek to impose one version of Islam as state law. It's common that they come from an irreligious background. It's common that they come from, on average, and this is statistically demonstrated, they come from an educated background, which is above the average levels of university education. They come from a liberal background, and they experience, first of all, a political conversion, and then they have to, I suppose as an afterthought, become a bit more pious. But actually, primarily, it's a political conversion.
At the time you became, as you say, an extremist, 16 was what we're talking about, had you in fact read the Quran?
No.
No.
No, never.
So you became a Muslim extremist without ever having read the Quran?
Again, that's a very common thing. That's right. So because they don't have religious backgrounds. I mean, they are people who essentially have a sense of political grievance, and then the political narrative is built on top of that, and Islam is used to justify essentially what are political positions.
So you joined this organization.
Yeah.
What was the organization?
It's called Hizb ut-Tahrir,
And what does that mean?
the Liberation Party.
And what does it represent? Is it a jihadi organization? Is it about blowing up World Trade Centers, or is it about something else?
So the group is still legal in the West, including in the States, in the UK. What they believe in is all of the ideas of Al-Qaeda without the methodology, without the terrorism. So essentially the idea of forcibly unifying Muslim majority nations under one global caliphate that implements an interpretation, a single unitary interpretation of Islam as state law, and then an expansionist foreign policy. So that state will then intend and aim on conquest. They believe in obliterating Israel, for example, through a foreign policy that they call Jihaad. It's a cynical use of the term. They've pretty much monopolized that term these days. But so it's the political side of what Al-Qaeda believes in without the terrorism. So then you may ask, how do they intend to get to that stage without terrorism? And that's what we did. We recruited officers from armies, specifically the Pakistani army, and we were agitators for military coups. In 2003, Musharraf discovered a cell in the Pakistani army that I was partly responsible for recruiting. We found them in Sandhurst, the military academy in London. They were cadets that were sent there for training, and we recruited them to Hizb ut-Tahrir. And just in fact...
Must be pretty ripe ground to begin with in the Pakistani
Yeah,
army.
well, of course, you know, General Zia began a lot of this for us, so it made it very easy for us to do. Just a few months ago, they discovered another officer, in fact, a 2-star general in the Pakistani army who was a member of the group that I helped set up in 4 different countries, Brigadier Ali Khan.
You were just spreading goodwill wherever you went.
Yeah. Yeah.
So eventually, in fact, you were arrested.
In Egypt.
You were taking these ideas to different countries, and this organization to different countries. You get to Egypt, and what happens?
So I think it's really important to mention something here, and that's that the age group of people that are doing this, because it's lethal, these are young kids. I was 16 when I joined, and by the time I'd set this up and recruited army officers in Pakistan and set up a Danish-Pakistani chapter in Denmark, was on the leadership in the UK, and then ended up becoming responsible for reviving the group in Egypt, by the time of my arrest, I was only 24 years old.
Well, the sense of power and of empowerment must be enormous for a young man under those circumstances.
And that's why I'm making this point, that you've got 60% of countries such as Pakistan or Iran, we were talking about Egypt, Yemen, 60 to 50% of these countries' populations are currently under the age of 20, 22. 18 in Yemen's case. It's a huge youth bulge. And these are young people that have nothing else to do because the economy is so bad, and they want a sense of empowerment. They feel emasculated. And in my case, this gave me a sense of fighting back against the system, against colonialism, sticking two fingers up to society and saying, I'm going to make my own world, and I'm going to make up my own rules.
And then you got to Egypt.
So my activities, I arrived one day before the 9/11 attacks in Egypt.
Oh, great timing.
I had nothing to do with that, okay? Wasn't me.
You were there to see your friend Mohammed Atta, was that right?
We completely underestimated the effect the 9/11 would have on our work. I think everyone wasn't expecting what would happen next. Hosni Mubarak, and it's interesting what happened to him, but Hosni Mubarak,
We'll get to that.
we will. I'd like to speak about him. Hosni Mubarak decided to use 9/11 and the war on terror to clamp down on everyone, as was his pet hobby. So we were detained in 2002. We were, as was their custom, taken in the middle of the night, blindfolded, hands were tied behind our backs with rags, taken across the desert, taken into an underground dungeon in a building called Al-Gihaz, which was the feared headquarters of the state security. Given numbers in chronological order, so I was 42. And then from day one, they began going through the numbers in a roll call, one by one, calling up number one, taking him to go off, and they would electrocute number one. And then they would call up number two and electrocute number two. And how they would electrocute people was by stripping them naked and then applying electricity to their teeth and their genitalia. And in many cases, they did it to wives, the wives of the suspected detainees, to force the husbands to confess. So imagine you're number 30 and you have to listen to 29 people before you, systematically tortured by electricity, and you're sitting there waiting for your turn. So I was 42 and I had to wait until 42 was called. And when 41 was called, I don't know what this guy looks like. He was blindfolded, I was blindfolded, and he was lying on top of me in the corridor. Poor guy was crying his eyes out, the one who was before me. And they called his name, and he obviously, I whispered to him my name. So he said, Maajid. I said, what? He's speaking Egyptian Arabic. He said, I'm feeling really scared. I don't know what to do. And can you help me? I said, how do you want me to help you? And literally, he's a grown man, and he was weeping. He said, I don't know what to do. They're going to call me next. So all I could do is I began reciting some passages from the Quran, which by that time I had memorized, to try and calm his soul. But they did take him away, and he was returned unconscious, and he was just lumped on the floor next to me. And I had to listen to the man scream. I've never seen him since.
Let me ask you a question about that torture. Are they asking you questions when they're torturing you like that? I mean, is this for the purpose of gaining information, or is it for the purpose of breaking you, or both?
It's both. So what they did in my case is they electrocuted somebody before me and then played my questions off against their answers. That other person was also a British citizen. And for some reason, just like when the racists attacked us in Essex, they stabbed my white friends and didn't stab me, though I was the only Paki in the crowd. They wanted to make an example of these blood traitors who had befriended the Pakistani. And so similarly here, I expected fully to be electrocuted, and what they did instead was electrocute the other guy. And they were asking questions about our purpose, our organizational plans. So there was an intelligence value to it, but at the same time, there was a punishment value, there was an intimidation value. They were happy with the fact that everyone in Egypt knew that the minute you enter that building, you're going to get tortured, whether you're guilty or not. We had to use the floor, and no sanitation, and I remember using my shoes as a pillow. That lasted for 3 months, and then when we were charged, we were then put on general release. We were in a political prison, so we were mixing exclusively with political prisoners. But at the time I was put into prison, in Egypt at that time, there were 25,000 political prisoners who had been there, many of them for over 10 years without charge. So when we talk about Guantanamo Bay, which I, in principle, disagree with, yeah? So I'm pointing at the American here, I didn't mean to blame you for it. But when we talk about Americans setting up Guantanamo Bay, no, but the Arabs have been doing this for a long time. They have at the time I went to prison, for over 10 years, there were people that had been detained without charge, without trial, and their numbers were in the 25,000 range, and that was just in Egypt, let alone in other countries.
And yet, you emerged from this experience as an anti-extremist. And I have to say, from after what you've just said, I'm having a little trouble with that. I mean, it would make me, I think, more of an extremist. It would make me more angry. It would give me more reason to want to wreak vengeance, at the very least, on the people who had done this. So how is it that you go through this experience and you come out of it an anti-extremist?
So in my cell, in the period of solitary confinement, you know, I obviously by this time felt that I'd lost everything. I was a law student. I graduated eventually, but at the time I didn't know if I'd ever graduate. And I had a child and a wife who were in the UK. I mean, they had to witness my arrest, but then they went to the UK. And I felt like I'd lost everything. And I never knew if I would be released, because obviously now the war on terror had started and the rules of the game had changed, as somebody said famously. So during those 3 months, actually did swear to myself that I would seek revenge, and prepared myself psychologically to become a suicide bomber against the Egyptian police authorities, against the state security. But I think they were the ravings of a madman, to be honest. Solitary confinement can do things to your mind. Some would say that the effects are lasting, but no, I like to think I'm quite sane now. But no, so they
I'd like to think that too.
Yeah. I'm not going to spontaneously combust right here, okay? So at the time I was in solitary confinement, I had these thoughts of revenge, really serious thoughts, and many Egyptians have. That prison that I was held in was the prison where Sayyid Qutb, and for those of you who don't know, Sayyid Qutb was the man who inspired modern-day terrorism in the form of jihadism. Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, they all read his book, Milestones. He wrote it in that prison. In fact, I was in prison with a man who smuggled the book out of prison for him. He was much, much older than me, and he's now the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, Dr. Muhammad Badir. But at the time, he was with Sayyid Qutb, because Sayyid Qutb started with the Muslim Brotherhood. And he experienced torture, and many people become more extreme as a result of torture in prison and become terrorists after having just been extremists. So then the question people ask is, why did, in your case, did it happen the other way around?
What was your epiphany? What was the thing?
And I think there wasn't one moment. I think that just like the Arab uprisings, there has to be a combination of the right time with the right events and the right people. I was in prison with the who's who of the political scene in Egypt. I had the assassins of Anwar Sadat, the former president, with me in prison, and that's one end of the extreme, all the way through to the current leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, so we're going towards now more political Islamism, all the way through to the liberal political prisoners, Ayman Noor, who contested Mubarak in 2005's general elections and was sentenced to 7 years in prison as a reward.
And whose wife worked for Newsweek for 20 years.
And she was at the time working for Newsweek. She's no longer, I think. Saadaddin Ibrahim, and all the way through to people convicted for homosexuality, who were funnily enough put in the political prison with us. And this is a funny anecdote actually, because you can imagine on the one hand, jihadi assassins of the former president of Egypt sitting here in prison having to eat with homosexuals in the same political prison. It was really quite funny. The guy who was accused in the homosexuality case, it was called the Queen's Boat case, insisted until his release that he wasn't gay, because he was so petrified, I think, of what would happen to him in that prison. But that led to something. It led to an atmosphere where we were able to openly discuss and debate for 4 solid years in prison.
Sort of a think festival kind of
Yeah.
thing.
So I was going to say, before everyone started clapping, we didn't have 50% of the audience as women, so we didn't have that advantage, and we didn't have the technology that you can see behind us. So it led for, the absence of the women led for a less quality in terms of the conversation. But no, we were seriously engaged in some really heavy political debates. And it coincided with something, and I think the Arab uprisings wouldn't have been possible if not for this significant, hugely significant event. And that was that Egypt's largest terrorist organization, it's known as Jama'a al-Islamiyya, and they were causing a real mess in Egypt in the 90s with attacks in Sharm el-Sheikh and everything. Their founder was in prison with us, Sheikh Salah Hashim. Now the group, as a whole, as a leadership, denounced terrorism and began writing against it. and it went through a de-radicalization process. And those guys and their books were available to us in prison. And we were debating with them. I initially approached them as this arrogant 24-year-old revolutionary who thought that he was right and everyone else was wrong, saying to these men who'd been in prison for all of my life, literally from 81, I was born in 77. So I would have been 3 years old in 81, and these guys have been in prison since then. And I was approaching them saying, you guys have sold out, you've gone soft. What people say to me now, yeah? Young kids, 16-year-olds say that to me now, and I was in this arrogant, delusional state thinking I could reconvince them of the truth of jihadist thinking. And of course, these are people that have far more experience than I did. Over the course of the 4 years of discussion, my views began changing. And the last thing that was crucial was that Amnesty International adopted me as a prisoner of conscience and began campaigning for my release. And here was an enemy that I defined as the soft power tool of colonialism, sticking their neck out and campaigning for my release when my own group weren't campaigning for my release because I was a fallen soldier and they were more focused on achieving the objective. So that had a profound impact on me emotionally. And I think what happened in that prison, in Mazar Tora prison in Cairo, with all of the key players that went on to lead the Arab uprising in Egypt, I think it was a precursor. The Arab Spring happened on a micro level to us before it happened on a macro level to Egyptian society.
I have the feeling we're going to start hearing the tinkling of an insidious little bell soon.
Yeah.
So let's move along now to what you would see.
On cue.
I just have these instincts.
Yeah.
Let's move along to, in fact, what you are doing to fight extremism now. You founded Quilliam in Britain, which is about ideas, and Khudi in Pakistan, which is more about action. What are you doing now to fight extremism? And how do you do it?
The same thing that drove me to join Hizb ut-Tahrir is now driving me, the same motivational factors, apart from the insecurity and the identity crisis, but a sense of justice and a desire for justice is driving me now to try and undo some of the stuff that I personally take responsibility for. And it's not easy, it has personal consequences in one's personal life, and obviously it has consequences in terms of security. But what we're trying to do is, we believe that the neoconservative model was upside down. We believe that to impose democracy at the barrel of a gun, or to attempt to do so when there was no demand for that on the grassroots, was the wrong way around. Why not change it around? Why not set up an institution in the West that corrects the mistakes of policy, the endorsement of torture, arbitrary detention, rendition, invasions, corrects those mistakes in policy through a think tank route in the West. And yet in Muslim majority countries, and nowhere better to start than Pakistan, and I'm a dual national and a proud British Pakistani, to start in Pakistan by working with the youth, to do something that's never been attempted before. And that is to create, and please bear with me when I explain this, because it's going to sound really funny, to create the Hamas equivalent of a youth-led democratic movement, the Al-Qaeda equivalent of a democratic movement. What I mean by that is, for 13 years, I worked in 4 different countries on a leadership level, setting up cells that recruited young people very effectively, and army officers, to a cause. I know how to do that. It's probably the only thing I do know how to do, to be honest. And why not use those transferable skills to create the inverse, the mirror image of those movements? Why did Hamas eclipse Fatah in the occupied territories over the course of the 80s to the 90s? Why in Pakistan are Lashkar-e-Taiba the most effective at responding to flood relief? Lashkar-e-Taiba, LET, a terrorist organization. Why are they the most effective at responding to flood relief and thereby gaining the sympathies of the people that live in those flood-afflicted areas? Why are there not young democratic activists combining values-based activism with relief work? So what we decided to do was set up Khudi in Pakistan to exactly do that. It's in its early days, it's premature, it's actually embryonic, it's only been a year and a half. We've only got so far 8 committees across the country. We've got thousands of volunteers, but that's nothing compared to what the other side have. And it's going to take 10 to 20 years before you even start seeing a change, but that's what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to change the fabric, the culture of the debate in civil society.
I think it's very positive to want to make those changes. Of course, the question is how? What's the message? And we were talking a little bit about this earlier this morning. Do you think that the events in Egypt, the Arab Spring, the events in Tunisia, the events in the Arab world, are those going to help you articulate a message that reaches out to young people, that can inspire the 16-year-old looking for identity?
Absolutely. When I spoke like this a year ago, before the Arab uprisings, people thought that I was trying to achieve the impossible because people had a dichotomy in their minds, encouraged by the despots in the Arab world, that either you support us or you support the terrorists. And there's no third way because Muslims aren't ready for democracy. And I've got to say this, even if the bell rings, because it's an important point to make, that actually in the West as well, sadly, there were these well-meaning liberals who were actually reversely racist and who would be Orientalist in their outlook and say, Muslim culture is this, and to try and talk about democracy in Muslim-majority societies is colonialist, and therefore they would, in a patronizing way, try and maintain their romanticized version of what Muslim culture should be, which actually is colonialist. Because don't tell me what my culture should be. You know, if I think, as a Muslim, that democracy is perfectly compatible with Islam and Muslim-majority societies, then I don't want some well-meaning liberal to come to me and say, well, actually, that's not really compatible with Islam, so you're on a losing cause. And that's what was happening until the Arab uprisings. What that did was instantly rebrand young Muslim youth. And the world's imagination was suddenly riveted by the fact that young Muslims can not just strap bombs to themselves and die for terrorism, killing civilians, but can do what we saw in Tiananmen Square, that moment where somebody is confronting a tank, but for democratic values, for freedom, for liberation, and not because they want to kill someone. The Egypt uprising was especially important in this regard because the young activists, I know them, the April 6 movement and others, the Kifaya movement, these guys actually articulated something that had never been articulated in Egypt in that popular way before, and that was that to challenge Mubarak, we're interested in removing the leader for our rights. That doesn't make us Israeli agents, it doesn't make us American agents, and it doesn't make us Islamists. We want freedom. And that narrative instantly rebranded young Muslims and has proven that it can be done. It can be done in Pakistan. It's going to take time. Pakistan doesn't need a revolution. Pakistan is it's a nascent democracy. It needs time for those democratic processes to mature, but crucially what it needs is, it has elections. What it needs is the democratic culture in civil society, and that's effectively preaching. We need to be preaching democratic values as Islamists preach extremist values. It's going to take many, many years, but I think it can be done.
I think that's the final bell. Thank you very much.